My dad smirked. Only legitimate grandkids get cake. And my daughter slowly put her plate down. My husband just stared at them, then quietly tapped his glass, stood up, and said one sentence that made my parents go pale as ghosts. So you want the truth now? I can still hear the clink of my daughter's fork hitting her plate. It was this tiny, metallic sound that somehow cut straight through 50 people murmuring inside my parents' house in Bakersfield. My father had just said it, loud enough for the room to hear, soft enough that he could pretend it was a joke if anyone challenged him. Only legitimate grandkids get a slice of the cake, he smirked, lifting his bourbon like he'd just delivered the punchline of the century. My daughter froze. She's 9, old enough to understand tone if not the whole meaning. She lowered her plate so slowly it felt like watching her heart sink in real time. Her lips pressed together, eyes dropping to the floor. My mother didn't say a word, just tightened her jaw and focused on rearranging the dessert table as if ignoring the moment made it disappear. I felt heat rising up my neck, but I stayed seated. I had learned a long time ago that reacting to my father's digs only made him dig deeper. My husband, Ethan, hadn't learned that rule, or maybe he'd never accepted it, and when he looked at me, I knew he wasn't going to let it slide. He stared from me to our daughter, and then to my parents like he was taking inventory of everyone's silence. I saw something shift in his face, something calm and final. He tapped his glass with the end of his knife. A sharp, deliberate sound. Conversations died instantly. Chairs stopped creaking. Even my father, who rarely gave anyone the dignity of full attention, turned toward him with that lazy smirk that said he was already preparing to dismiss whatever came next. Ethan pushed back his chair, stood up, and slid one hand into his pocket like he had rehearsed this moment. His voice, when he spoke, was steady, not angry, not loud, but so clear it cut straight through the air. "I think," he said, scanning the room, "there's something everyone here deserves to know." My stomach dropped. My father chuckled under his breath, assuming Ethan was about to apologize or smooth things over. That's what people did around him: bend, soften, appease. I held my daughter's hand under the table and hers was trembling. Ethan didn't look at me. He didn't look at my father. He fixed his gaze on the stunned faces of extended family. Cousins who whispered behind my back. An aunt who loved drama more than her own kids. My brother who always followed my father's lead like a shadow. "You want to talk about legitimacy?" Ethan said. "Fine, let's." A hush spread like fog. My mother's knuckles went white on the edge of the cake platter. My father straightened slightly, sensing, finally, that whatever was coming wasn't in his control. I tried to breathe. I couldn't. Ethan lifted his glass. "Because if we're doing that," he continued, "then this family has a secret that's about to make that word very inconvenient." My father's smirk fell. My daughter looked up at him, confused but hopeful in that fragile way children look at the adults who are supposed to protect them. And then Ethan said the first sentence that made the entire room go pale, really pale, like the color had been sucked out of the air along with the oxygen. But right before he delivered the rest, he turned to me, his eyes hard but steady, and nodded once, like he was granting me a chance to stop him. I didn't move. He opened his mouth. And everything that had been buried in my family for years finally clawed its way to the surface. I grew up in a house where silence was treated like good behavior, and obedience was mistaken for love. My father wasn't the yelling type. He was worse. He let his disappointment do the talking, slow and deliberate, like a judge handing down a sentence he'd already decided before you walked into the room. My mother floated in his shadow, always smoothing, always deflecting, always pretending we were a normal family. The first wound came when I was 12. I'd auditioned for the school play, small role, nothing special, but it meant everything to me. When I told my father I'd gotten the part, he didn't congratulate me. He didn't even look up from the paper. He just said, "Maybe try aiming for something real next time." At the cast party, I watched other kids take pictures with their parents while mine stayed home. That was the first time I realized I was never going to be real enough for him. The second wound cut deeper. I was 17 and had gotten into UC Davis on a partial scholarship. I was proud. Terrified, but proud. My father looked at the letter and said, "You're not Davis material. Community college first. Let's be realistic." I didn't fight him. I didn't know how to. I ended up at Bakersfield College, working evenings at a grocery store while he told relatives I wasn't ready for a real university yet. My brother, meanwhile, got a used car just for managing a C average. My mother told me to let it go because your father doesn't mean anything by it. But he did. He always did. The third wound was the one that never healed. I got pregnant at 26, planned, loved, wanted. Ethan and I had been together 3 years by then. We weren't married yet, but we were committed, steady, building a life. When I told my parents, my mother cried, not happy tears. My father stared at me with that same cold appraisal he used when reading a disappointing bill at a restaurant. "Does he know it's his?" he asked. I remember the sound of my breath leaving my body. I remember Ethan stiffening next to me. I remember my mother whispering his name in warning, like please don't, but also like you always do this. That was the moment Ethan understood what I had never been able to articulate. My father didn't just treat me like a failure, he treated me like a liability. Someone who could embarrass him. Someone he needed to diminish before anyone else could. When our daughter was born, my father didn't come to the hospital. My mother came alone with a gift bag that still had the price tags on the blankets. She stayed 20 minutes. She held my daughter like she was holding a question she didn't want to answer. For years after that, we kept our distance. Holidays were strained, visits short. My father rarely acknowledged my daughter as family, never said granddaughter, never used her name unless prompted. But Ethan tried. For me, for the idea of peace, he tried. Until tonight. Tonight was my mother's 60th birthday, the first big family gathering we'd attended in nearly 8 years. We agreed to go because she asked with this thin, desperate hope that maybe things could be normal for just one evening. I should have known better. The moment my father made that legitimate grandkids comment, something inside me snapped, but not loud, not visible. More like a final thread quietly severing. And Ethan, he must have felt it too. Because when he stood up, tapped his glass, and said there was something everyone needed to know, I realized he wasn't reacting to one cruel comment. He was reacting to every wound my father had ever carved into me. Ethan always said you can survive almost anything if you know what you're surviving for. For him, it was our daughter. For me, for a long time, it was just the idea that I could someday be someone different from the girl my father raised, someone who didn't flinch at a tone of voice, someone who didn't shrink in her own skin. The years leading up to tonight didn't move in a straight line. They lurched. They scraped. They forced me to rebuild myself in ways I never planned to. 2 years after our daughter was born, I cut off almost all contact with my parents. Not out of strength, out of exhaustion. Every call with my mother felt like a performance. Every conversation with my father felt like a test I was born to fail. I told Ethan I didn't want our daughter growing up believing that love looked like biting your tongue while someone dismantled you. He said he agreed, but I could see how much it hurt him to watch me pull away from the only family I had. I think that's when my transformation really began, not in a dramatic, fiery moment, but in a quiet decision I kept having to remake. I would not allow my father's voice to live inside our daughter the way it lived inside me. I started therapy. I started running. I started saying no to things that made me small. And every time I did, I felt this strange mix of relief and grief, because every bit of growth proved how much I had needed it. Still, it wasn't clean. My father had this way of sneaking back into my life through guilt. A birthday card for my daughter with no message inside. A text from my mother saying, "He's trying, you know." A comment from my brother that I was holding a grudge and making things awkward for everyone else. And then last year, my mother was diagnosed with early-stage lymphoma. When she told me, her voice cracked the way it never did when the wounds were mine. I drove to their house the same day. My father didn't say thanks. He just nodded, like he was granting me access to a crisis he owned. But I stayed for her, not for him. I brought meals. I took her to 2 appointments. I helped her organize her medications. Every time I walked through their door, I fought the urge to turn around. My father found small ways to remind me of my place. "You look tired. Maybe Ethan should be the one handling the finances. You always were emotional." Nothing outright cruel, just enough to press old bruises. But I kept going back, trying to prove to myself that I could be stronger than the past. Trying to believe my mother when she whispered, He's softened with age. He hadn't. He'd just gotten better at masking the blade. Ethan saw it. He warned me gently at first, then firmly. "You don't owe him anything," he said one night after my father criticized our daughter's handwriting. "You're bleeding for the man who sharpened the knife." Still, I tried. So when my mother's birthday invitation arrived, her handwriting shaky, hopeful, I said yes. Not for reconciliation, not for forgiveness, for closure. I thought I was ready. But tonight proved something I hadn't wanted to face. My father wasn't going to change, and the cost of pretending he might was no longer mine alone. It was bleeding into our daughter's life now. When he made that legitimate grandkids comment, I felt every mile I run, every therapy session, every boundary I'd fought to build crumble inside me. I felt the old humiliation, the old helplessness, the old instinct to disappear. Except this time, Ethan stood up before I could fold. I had no idea what he was about to reveal, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity as he lifted his glass. Whatever came next had been building for years, and there was no turning back. Ethan didn't rush. That was the first sign this wasn't anger speaking, it was certainty. He held his glass the way people hold a fuse they're about to light. "You want to talk about legitimacy?" he said again, louder this time. "Then let's start with the truth this family has been hiding for decades." My father scoffed, but I saw the flicker barely there, gone in an instant, a twitch near his eye. Fear disguised as irritation. My mother whispered his name like a warning. Ethan continued anyway. "For 9 years," he said, "my daughter has been treated like a question mark, someone whose place at her own grandmother's birthday party needs to be justified. And all because a man in this room can't stand the idea of anyone else having value he can't measure or control." A murmur rippled through the crowd. My father shot up straighter in his chair, voice sharp. "Watch yourself." Ethan didn't even look at him. "I'm done watching," he said. "I'm done pretending, and since you chose tonight to open the door, I'm going to walk everyone right through it." My pulse hammered. "Ethan," I whispered, not to stop him, but because I suddenly understood. He wasn't about to defend our daughter. He was about to expose something. Something he'd been holding, waiting, maybe even dreading. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. Thick, official-looking, creased from being handled too many times. My father froze. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Ethan laid the envelope on the table in front of my father with the softest, deadliest finality I had ever heard. "DNA results," he said. The room sucked in air like a single organism. I felt the world tilt. Ethan continued, voice steady as stone. "3 months ago, after another round of your insinuations, your comments, your little jokes, after watching you undermine your daughter while bragging about your son, I decided to put something to rest. I wanted to settle the question you kept dangling over her head, the one you built your power on." My father didn't move, didn't blink. Ethan looked directly at him. "I tested our daughter's DNA, not because I doubted her. Because I doubted you." My stomach knotted. I looked at him sharply. "You did what?" But Ethan shook his head, not at me but at the room. "That's not the twist. The twist is what I compared it to." A gasp came from somewhere in the back. He placed his hand on the envelope. "I had her DNA compared to yours." My hearing went fuzzy. People leaned forward. My father went sheet white, the bourbon glass in his hand trembling. Ethan's voice dropped. "And guess what? No match, none." "Not with you." My father opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Ethan pressed on, unflinching. "Which means all these years, every dig, every accusation, every question you threw at your own daughter about whether her child was legitimate, you were projecting." Gasps. Whispers, someone swore under their breath. My mother closed her eyes. Ethan said it clearly, fully, with a finality that cracked the room open. "You are not biologically related to the woman you've spent her entire life controlling." My legs went weak. Air disappeared. I gripped the edge of the table to stay upright. My father's mouth opened in a silent, strangled breath, his face collapsing in on itself, not from guilt, not from shame, but from losing something he had ruled with for decades. Authority. My mother's eyes fluttered, full of terror and something else, recognition. Ethan looked at me then, softening. "You deserve to know," he said quietly. My father slammed his palm on the table. That test is wrong, but his voice cracked. And in that crack, I heard the truth. He already knew. My father's denial didn't ring like disbelief. It rang like a habit, a reflex he'd sharpened over decades of rewriting reality until it bowed to him. But now the room wasn't bowing. It was watching him with the same stunned, horrified curiosity you'd give a collapsing building. He kept shaking his head, muttering, "Fake, manipulated, ridiculous." But his eyes were locked on my mother, wide and accusing, as if searching for a script she'd always handed him before. She didn't move, didn't blink. And that stillness told me everything. I felt something cold and clean settle inside me, an internal click, like the final piece of a lock falling into place. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one scrambling to prove myself. I wasn't the one shrinking, apologizing, shrinking even more. My father was on the defensive, I was standing. But the shock didn't erase the betrayal, it sharpened it. Because I realized in that moment that my entire childhood, every criticism, every belittling comment, every restriction, every time he told me I wasn't enough, came from a man who had never even been my father. He had known, and he had punished me anyway. While the room erupted, whispers, gasps, chairs scraping, my mind didn't swirl, it narrowed, focused. Ethan placed a hand on my back, but I barely felt it. Something in me was done being stunned. Something in me wanted answers, wanted accountability, wanted revenge, not the vindictive kind, the kind built on truth, the kind that pulls the rot out by the root. I stepped forward, close enough to see the panic trembling at the edges of my father's, no, the man's eyes. "When were you going to tell me?" I asked quietly. He swallowed. "This is nonsense." "When?" I repeated. My mother reached out as if to stop me, then let her hand fall, resigned. That told me even more. The man's jaw clenched. "We agreed, so you did know." The room went still again. He looked away, and that was the closest he had ever come to admitting anything. That was all I needed. I straightened, voice low. "If you spent my entire life resenting a child you knew wasn't yours, I want the truth behind that resentment." "All of it?" His nostrils flared. "Watch your tone." "No," I said. "I'm done watching anything." And that was the moment the retaliation plan snapped into place. Not the final strike, not yet, but the strategy, the path. The clean, cold direction. Because this wasn't just a family secret. This was leverage. This was motive. This was the pressure point he'd tried to bury for decades. I looked at Ethan. He understood instantly. His hand slid into mine, not guiding me but standing with me. We stepped back from the table, away from the chaos, while the man sputtered excuses and my mother wilted beside him, eyes wet but silent. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked softly. "No," I said honestly, "but I'm clear. What do you want to do?" I didn't have to think long. "I want everything he built on lies to collapse," I said, "but I'm not doing it out of anger. I'm doing it because he raised me under a false name, a false story, a false identity, and used those lies to punish me. I want the truth exposed, entirely, publicly, in a way he can't twist." Ethan nodded, jaw tight. "Then we start with your mother," I exhaled. "She's the key, isn't she?" "She's the only one who knows the full story," he said, "and the only one he can't control now that the secret is out." I looked over at her, frail, trembling, staring into a lifetime she had buried. She was cracking, and through that crack the truth would come pouring out. I took a breath, steady, deliberate. "Then I'm going to ask her the one question he can't silence," and I started walking toward her. My mother looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, like the truth had pulled something vital out of her spine. She kept her hands clasped, twisting her fingers the way she did whenever she was about to lie or break. I stopped in front of her. Up close she looked older than 60, older than the room, older than the life she'd lived under him. "Mom," I said quietly, "I need you to tell me the truth. Who is my father?" Her eyes filled instantly, not with guilt, not with shame, but with something closer to dread. Not fear of him, fear of me, fear of what the truth would do. She whispered, but the man cut in sharply. "Don't," he barked. "Do not encourage this circus." Ethan stepped between us, blocking him. "If you interrupt her again," he said calmly, "I'm done being civil." My mother's breath trembled. "I never thought, I never wanted." She pressed a fist to her mouth like she was holding words back physically. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. It was one night, one time. I braced myself. Ethan squeezed my hand. She finally forced the words out. Your biological father was a coworker, someone kind, someone who didn't treat me the way your father did. And when I got pregnant, I didn't know who the father was. I told him it was his because I was scared. It wasn't nothing. It wasn't small. But it wasn't enough to knock the room silent. What she said next did. I didn't hide it from him, she whispered. He found out, years ago, before you were even born. I blinked. He knew the whole time. Yes, and he still. Yes. The room rippled with horrified murmurs. Ethan's voice dropped. So he punished her for 9 years, no, her entire life, because of a choice you made, my mother broke. It wasn't supposed to be punishment, she whispered. He said he would raise her, he said he could overlook it, but after she was born, he couldn't, Ethan finished. No, she whispered. He wouldn't. The man slammed a hand on the table again. This is a private matter. No, Ethan said. It stopped being private when you tried to humiliate a child tonight. My mother's shoulders shook. I'm sorry, she said, voice cracking. I'm so sorry. I thought if I just kept the peace, it would be okay. I thought I could keep you safe by keeping him calm. It was twisted. It was tragic. It was her lifelong habit, surviving him by sacrificing herself and me. But then my mother lifted her chin just barely and said something that shifted the entire floor beneath us. There's more. The room held its breath. My stomach dropped. What more? She looked at me, eyes wide and terrified. He told me long ago that if the truth ever came out, if you ever found out he wasn't your biological father, he would cut you out of the family entirely. And not just emotionally. I frowned. What do you mean? She swallowed. He updated the estate. The house, the land, the accounts. He put everything in your brother's name unless you stayed under his authority. It was leverage, all of it. The man didn't deny it. His silence was the confirmation. But then my mother's voice broke again. He didn't just change the estate, he added something else. Ethan stepped closer. What did he add? My mother met my eyes with a trembling horror. A clause. One I never thought he'd enforce because I thought the truth would never be spoken out loud. My breath caught. What clause? If you ever challenged him, if you ever confronted him about the past, he set it up so that your daughter, her voice cracked, would be the one cut off. Not you, the air collapsed. Everyone froze. He hadn't just punished me. He'd preloaded a trap for my child, silent, calculated, waiting. My daughter, who he'd just humiliated in front of 50 people, had been the target all along. Ethan's hand tightened around mine like he was trying to keep me standing. The truth hit me so hard it felt physical. This wasn't a man losing control. This was a man who had engineered my entire life to stay in control. And now that the truth was out, the real confrontation wasn't going to be about biology. It was going to be about the one thing he had always used as a weapon: power. I turned toward him, the man who'd raised me, belittled me, controlled me, and now sat rigid in his chair as if the entire room were a battlefield he suddenly found himself losing. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of him. I wasn't even angry. I was clear. Why? I asked. He didn't answer, not at first. He looked around the room, searching for someone, anyone, to rescue him from the truth closing in. But no one moved. Not my brother, who had always defended him. Not my aunts and uncles, who fed on the drama but were now startled into stillness. Not even my mother, who had spent decades translating his cruelty into something survivable. He was alone, and he knew it. Why did you keep me? I asked again. Why did you raise me if you knew I wasn't yours? Why did you stay? Why did you punish me for it? Why did you set financial traps for a child? Why did you make my daughter your collateral? His jaw twitched. His hand tightened around his bourbon glass, and when he finally spoke, his voice was flat, so flat it chilled the air. Because you weren't mine, he said. It wasn't an explanation. It was a wound, sharpened into a blade. He leaned forward, shoulders stiff, eyes hardening into something colder than anger. Do you know what it's like, he said, to have a wife shame you, to go to work every day knowing people talk? To walk into a church and see the looks. To hold a child you didn't create while she looks at you like she expects something from you you never agreed to give. My stomach lurched. Ethan stepped closer behind me, but I lifted a hand slightly. I needed to hear this. I needed it spoken out loud. She was a mistake, he said, her mother's mistake. My mother flinched as if he'd slapped her, and I was stuck cleaning it up, taking responsibility, pretending, living with it. His voice grew harder. She was a reminder, every day, every time she asked for something, every time she cried, every time she looked at me with that same needy expression. I felt a cold bloom under my ribs. Children, he said, earn their place. She never earned hers. The room recoiled even the relatives who had always defended him. She was a burden, he continued. Expecting love I didn't owe her, expecting pride I couldn't give. Expecting a relationship she didn't deserve. His nostrils flared. Your daughter is the same. Another mouth, another expectation, another claim on something she has no right to. I felt the words slice through the last remaining threads of the daughter I had once been. He took a breath, slow and deliberate, like he was finally telling the truth he'd carried like a rotten seed for years. Blood is the only thing that matters, he said. It's the only thing that binds a family. Everything else is obligation. Everything else is weakness. I gave you a roof, I gave you food, I kept your mother from ruining her reputation, and you repay me by dragging this circus into my home. His lips curled. You were never my child. And you never will be. All the air in the room thinned. My mother sobbed softly into her hands. My brother stared at the floor. Ethan's breath trembled with fury. But me, a strange calm washed over me. Because for the first time in my life, he had said the quiet part outright. The part he'd used to shape my entire existence. The part he had always made me feel but never allowed me to name. He had never loved me. He had never wanted me. He had tolerated me out of pride and punished me out of resentment. And he had weaponized that resentment against my daughter before she could even understand what he was. The truth wasn't liberating. It was devastating, but devastation can be clarifying. It burns away anything unnecessary, anything weak. I met his eyes, steady, unblinking. Then you're done, I said softly. He opened his mouth to argue. But he didn't know, I wasn't asking. I was ending, and the final part of this story, the part he couldn't control, was about to begin. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. The room was so quiet I could hear the air conditioner humming behind the kitchen wall. 50 people sat frozen in a moment none of them would ever forget. My mother wept softly. My brother's face was drained of color. My daughter watched me with wide, frightened eyes, waiting to know whether she was safe. I stepped toward him, toward the man who had spent my entire life diminishing me, undermining me, keeping me small enough to control. He straightened in his chair, as if bracing for another accusation he could swat away. He didn't understand yet. There was nothing to argue with. The verdict had already fallen. You're done, I repeated, calm and steady. Not just as a grandfather, not just as a parent. You're done having any power over me or my daughter ever again. He scoffed, but his voice wavered. You think you can dictate that? You think anything changes because of this little performance? I control the estate. I control the house. I control what your mother leaves behind. I cut him off. No, you don't. A ripple of confusion moved through the room. I reached into my bag and pulled out a second envelope, the one I hadn't planned to use tonight. The one I'd kept tucked away because I didn't know if I'd ever be ready. Turns out I was. I placed it on the table beside his untouched bourbon. His eyes darted to it. What is that? My preparation, I said. The part of me you underestimated. Ethan stepped beside me, his presence solid. She's not a child anymore, he said. She stopped being afraid of you a long time ago. My father glared at him. I can revoke everything. I can make sure she gets nothing. You can, I said. Except you won't. I tapped the envelope. Because I had a lawyer review your estate documents 6 weeks ago, the same lawyer who drew them up. I paused. And he told me something interesting, something you apparently didn't think anyone would ever discover. My father stiffened. My mother looked up, eyes wide and terrified. The clause you added, the one stating my daughter would be disinherited if I ever challenged you. The one meant to keep me silent? I slid the envelope closer to him. It's invalid, he blinked. That's impossible. It's void, I said, because you tied the clause to a condition based on biological lineage when you knew wasn't true. You used a lie to structure a legal threat, and legally that makes the entire clause unenforceable. The room erupted, gasps, whispers, shock spreading like wildfire. You're bluffing, he hissed. Open it, I said. He snatched the envelope and ripped it open. His hands shook as he read the letter, signed by the estate lawyer, stating clearly that the clause was null and that any attempt to enforce it could be challenged and overturned. He read it twice. Then a third time. With each pass, his face drained further of color. I didn't smile, I didn't revel, I just spoke the truth. You built your power on secrets, on shame, on making sure no one ever challenged you, but you got sloppy. You built one of your threats on a lie that could be proven false, and now the one thing you counted on, my silence, is gone. He looked up at me, desperate, furious, cornered. You can't. I already did, I said. I'm done, my daughter is done. And whether you want to admit it or not, you just lost the last weapon you ever had. My mother sobbed harder. My brother buried his face in his hands. My father sagged back in his chair, a man watching his kingdom crumble in real time. I turned to the room, not to defend myself, not to explain, but to finish it. Anyone who wants a relationship with me and my daughter can have one, I said, but it will not include him. Not anymore. Then I looked at my mother, her face broken, grieving, relieved in some painful blend of all three. She reached for me, but I shook my head gently. I need space, I whispered. For a long time. She nodded, tears streaming. I took my daughter's hand. Ethan took mine. And we walked out, not fast, not dramatic, just steady. Outside, the Bakersfield night was warm. My daughter leaned into me. Ethan wrapped his arm around us both. Are you okay? He asked. I thought about it, really thought. No, I said, but I'm free. We stepped off the porch and into the dark, three people who finally belonged to no one but themselves. And as the door closed behind us, I felt the last thread connecting me to that house snap clean. Not with anger, but with certainty. He could keep the land. He could keep the money. He could keep the walls built on resentment. I had something he would never touch again, my child, my truth, myself.